Right, good evening everyone. Today is about the prevent presentation and I'm going to introduce Travis, who's our guest speaker today, to talk about when he was in the London Bridge attack in 2017. So I'll hand over to you.
Well, I hope you don't mind me standing in this corner, it just helps me better with the clicker. But thanks everyone for the opportunity to come in today and speak to you. And thank you also to the Prevent folks for cluing me in with the college and linking you up with you. I'm not too keen on sounding my own voice, so I'd much prefer if we get a bit of like a back and forth going. So if you've got any questions, I'll get through the presentation and then feel free to fire away at the end. And nothing's off the cards, I should say either. You know, I've totally any questions. There's no question that's stupid, no question too difficult. So feel free to fire away. But to kick things off, my name is Travis. I'm 23, and I'm based up in Lancashire, in the northwest. At the moment, I'm doing a doctorate at Edge Hill, which, if some of you are applying to university, hopefully you'll know about us, but I won't be offended if you don't. It's quite a small uni. But about 6 years ago, I was actually in your position. I was, applying to unis, spending probably far too little time revising for my A levels, which was reflected in my results because I barely scraped my way into uni. But in a very similar position to yourselves. And fortunately, I managed to get a place in the end, and I started at Edge Hill in September 2016. And it was a history with politics degree, and I'd been there for a few months. It got to about March 2017, and we were given the opportunity to go on a trip down to London. It was a free trip, 3 days with my mates in London, and to be honest, I was embarrassingly a bit of a geek at the time for politics and stuff, so I jumped at the opportunity. So it's with the politics side of the course, and it was meeting with MPs and going sort of touring Parliament, that sort of thing. And I remember thinking that it was probably the last opportunity we'd have to actually have a bit of fun, because we were getting close to the exams, getting close to all the deadlines and stuff. I think exams were in May and deadlines were in April. So it's the last chance that we really had to actually, just spend some time with your mates. So we got down to London, spectacularly late on the first day. We spent about 5.5 hours on a sweaty coach. And to be honest, we missed all the activities we had planned for that first day. And naturally, we headed straight to the pub as soon as we'd arrived, because it was so late that we literally had no other activities planned for the day. Now, if this works, yeah. So this is a photo of us actually in the pub on that night before, the 21st. Looking quite fresh-faced actually. I would have blown it up if I'd known the size of the screen, but I hope it gives an idea anyway. But we were up early the next morning for what was meant to be a jam-packed day of activities in and outside of Parliament. And we just returned from lunch about 2 o'clock, and we had a meeting with Rosie Cooper, who is the MP for Ormskirk, which is where Edge Hill is. And that was meant to be an hour long, but she ended up having to leave halfway through because she had to vote on some sort of law or legislation that was being passed. So we ended up having half an hour free time essentially. And we all decided to split off into separate groups because again it was not enough time to actually do anything, but enough time to sort of meander about for half an hour until the next meeting. There were a group of 16 of us on the trip, and one group, and a lecturer for example, went to the cafe in the House of Commons, and just decided to grab a coffee while they were waiting for the next meeting. Another group went shopping and sightseeing for a little bit, and then myself and about 4 of the lads just decided to catch some fresh air. To be honest, we probably won't put much thought into it. It's not something that you really think all that much about. We just decided to essentially take a walk for half an hour and just use up the time whilst we had it. So I put this picture up to give an idea, because I'm not sure how familiar you all are of that area, but the bottom right circle is where we left through the main entrance to Parliament. And we took a right, basically going in the exact opposite to the way that red arrow is, which shows the motion of the attack. So we took a right and we walked across Westminster Bridge in the direction of the London Eye, which is just out of shot in the top left. And we got about a third of the way, I think, across the bridge. I wasn't really paying much attention at the time. I was on my phone. I just took a picture of Big Ben for Snapchat and I put it on there, and then one of my friends was texting me about it. To be honest, we were probably all a little bit hungover anyway from the night before, so we were all a little bit spaced out. But we got about a third of the way along the bridge, and one of the lads in my group just shouted something along the lines of "Travis, look," or "Look out." And by the time I looked up, there was not really any time to react. All I saw was a terrorist 4x4 coming straight towards me. He'd mounted the pavements and essentially started hitting pedestrians. He'd started at the other side of the bridge and was coming towards us. And as I said, I didn't have any time to react. The police told me afterwards that they thought he was perhaps driving around 46 miles an hour when he hit me. And just that split second of seeing him coming, there just wasn't a chance to jump out the way or anything like that you hope you'd be able to do. A lot of people talk about this sort of life and death situation thing. I didn't have any, any epiphany or like life flash before my eyes sort of thing. I felt nothing. I just felt powerless essentially. I couldn't do anything. It was coming towards me, and that was it. I just had to deal with it. And the car hit me, and I went over the bonnet, smashed into the windscreen, and then went over and into the air. Now, I must have only been in the air for seconds, if that. It felt like forever. I remember sort of seeing the sky and seeing Big Ben out the corner of my vision, and then coming straight back down and hitting the concrete. Now, I was very lucky because one of the lads in my group, he got hit by the wing mirror of the car, and had already been knocked down to the floor. And when I landed, my head actually landed on his stomach and was cushioned. Because every other part of the body on the left side that hit the floor, hit the concrete, was fractured. But I wasn't aware of this at the time, and because I hadn't lost consciousness, because my head was cushioned, I got up and I started walking up and down the bridge. I remember being in a sort of autopilot mode, where I knew I had to collect my phone because obviously it was in my hand when I was hit by the car. Bizarrely, my shoes had been thrown off when I was hit by the car as well, so I was just sort of all I could focus on was getting down. And obviously saw a wide range of injuries and fatalities that were on the bridge. And one of the lads in our group was actually missing straight after the attack. So we were looking for him and looking, up and down the bridge. Someone had shouted that someone had gone over into the Thames. So we were looking over the side to see if that was him. Fortunately, he had actually, in the shock of it all, got separated from us. He doesn't know how, but he was found about 2 hours later in a pub in Vauxhall, and he has no idea how he got there. So that's, essentially a fight-or-flight situation. He just, I think, ran. But at that time we didn't know that, and we were worried that he could have been the person who'd gone over. And one of the other lads, the one who'd been hit by the wing mirror actually, who cushioned my fall, the blood from the laceration on his head was sort of going into his eyes, and he was getting quite panicked. And I tried to take my jacket off to stem the bleeding. I couldn't understand why, but I just couldn't get my jacket off. And I looked down, and I realised the reason I couldn't get it over my wrist was because my hand was essentially mangled. Fingers were all broken and twisted in different directions. The hand itself was broken. I broke every finger apart from the thumb. But they were all, most importantly, they were all twisted in different directions, so I physically couldn't get the cord over the wrist to stem his bleeding. And I think when I saw that, it sort of, the blood rushed to my head, and I knew I had to sit down, and I knew I was injured. And I think the adrenaline sort of flushed out of me. So I laid down the bridge, and I had my back against the parapet, and we essentially waited for paramedics and for police to arrive. We were very consciously aware that there were other people who required much more serious attention. So every time, paramedics and stuff would come along, we'd sort of pass them on. For example, just in front of me and to the left, there was a lady, a teacher, on the way to pick her kids from school. and she'd been hit by the car and thrown into the road, and sadly then been hit by a double-decker bus. Just behind me, there was a lady on holiday with a fiance, recently a fiance, because he'd actually proposed to her on that holiday, and she was hit and thrown into the Thames, and both of them sadly passed away. I know you think it's hilarious, man. I know you do, but it's not. As I said, both of them sadly passed away from their injuries. And once capacity became available, my friends were walked off the bridge, and they were taken to St Thomas Hospital, which is just at the other side of the bridge across from Palmer. But I had to wait for an ambulance. And as I essentially was sat there waiting, I started to zone out a bit. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but the coppers have sort of relayed this back to me later. I started to go pale, shaking, and essentially I was going into shock. And the paramedics realised I had a serious bleed somewhere. So they came over and they noticed that my pants were soaked, and they started cutting through the clothes. Some police officers laid a towel over me to try and sort of retain some dignity, and they cut it open and they found quite a bad laceration at the top of the left leg, which fortunately had missed the artery by mere centimetres. But they got me on a stretcher, slapped me in the back of an ambulance and took me to hospital. And that was about 40 minutes afterwards that I arrived in the hospital. And to be honest, from that point, it was a bit of a blur. I didn't get into an actual ward until about, I think it was about 12:30 midnight. So it was about 10 hours of scans that I had to go through. I had my first operation on my hand, which had to reset each of the fingers manually. So as you can imagine, it was pretty damn painful. Before they could put it in a cast. And then I had the stitches as well, obviously for the laceration. And then, as I say, I finally got to my ward at about 12:30, and then I was moved to a permanent ward around 4 or 5 in the morning. And when I was in that permanent ward, that's where I stayed then for about 8 days afterwards. Those 8 days were bizarre. I mean, I'd never broke a serious bone before or anything like that. I'd never had an extended hospital stay. And it was just a very strange sort of situation. There's a lot of stuff that I think isn't touched on when you see things like terrorism and trauma in TV and movies. I mean, my phone was pretty much dead for about 2 or 3 days after the attack because I was just receiving that many messages over Facebook and Twitter, and most of these were from family and friends. Well, some were from family and friends, but the majority actually were from journalists, demanding interviews. To the point where I either put my phone on charge permanently for 3 days, or it would die because it was pinging that much. It was insane. And I just couldn't understand. I couldn't understand what was so spectacular. All I'd done was survive. I was just one of the lucky ones. And yet, they were incredibly intrusive. They were trying to get into the ward. They were outside my parents' house, even though I obviously wasn't there because I was in hospital. So that was something that I think I certainly underestimated and had no knowledge of. But also I think the very physical aspects of it as well. I mean, for a week after the attack, my hair was falling out. Some of it, they said, was due to friction burns, because obviously I'd been dragged by the car. But they said the main reason was stress. Unfortunately, it wasn't permanent, but that was something that, again, I don't think we really know enough about. We sort of see an attack as being those, 30 seconds, a minute that it happens. But the effects are just, so incredibly further than that, and they last so long. But there were some ups during that time. On the third day, Edge Hill booked a train and hotel for my mum when she came down and visited me in hospital. And here's a few pictures of me in hospital, by the way. The guy in the top right I've blurred out because he wasn't affected by the attack, he was just in my ward. But the bottom picture is a picture of me and some of the other lads that were affected. That's a couple of weeks after the attack. And also on the third day after the attack, Prince Charles came to visit us in hospital, which again was, we were incredibly grateful for that, because this was maybe the second or third time I've been to London. It was not somewhere I was familiar with, and I didn't know any familiar faces. This felt very vulnerable. So to see someone who, you don't know them, but it's a familiar face, was very reassuring. And then, as we got to the end of those 8 days in hospital, on the 8th day I had my final operation. That was to put a screw in the leg because they told me I had fractured the leg as well as torn a ligament. And that repaired the leg, but the screw has to remain in there permanently. And then I was discharged home. And I spent 6 months on crutches and a walking stick after I'd gone home. And then roughly around 2 years in physiotherapy before I could properly sort of walk again. And the physiotherapy was weekly alongside my uni, so it wasn't as disruptive, but certainly that initial 6 months were difficult to say the least. That said, I, like all my friends, we're still here to tell the story. And I think, you know, if we can tell the tale, then we should. Because sadly there's a lot of people who aren't able to tell the tale because they didn't survive the attack. So that's why I think it's so important that we do things like this. So I don't think there's any way you can really come out of something like this, honestly, and not be psychologically or physically affected. And there's certainly been a lot of ups and downs over the years following for me personally. Definitely the first year after the attack, I felt a lot of guilt. That, you know, I'd survived and other people hadn't. I felt a lot of anger and disappointment that this had happened. You know, sort of thinking, why me? And I think it sort of shatters a sense of safety that, you know, when you're younger, you have, whether it's naivety or not, but you have this sort of sense of safety when you're younger. I mean, I was 19 when the attack happened, and it certainly shattered that. And I think, fortunately, because I had so much physical therapy to deal with, I think that probably took my mind off a lot of the psychological stuff, because some of the other lads who were affected were a hell of a lot more affected by the psychological side of things than I was, and I know they had to deal with a lot. But I think there's a sort of message here really for all of us, in that, and it's not necessarily a negative message, so to speak, but you know, this, for years I felt like there was an expectation that I was supposed to move on and just, you know, crack on with life as if nothing had happened. And I couldn't do that. I felt that I had to feel I was doing my bit, hence doing talks like this and hence doing the PhD at the moment in terrorism studies. And this is one thing that's held true throughout the entire experience. It's knowing that throughout those ups and downs, they're natural, and it's a very natural response in your body to a very unnatural event. And I think that's something we can all take forward, actually. Sort of having that, I guess, that sort of resilience to find something positive, as difficult as that is from something so grim, and to ensure that, you know, the lives that were lost aren't in vain. I'm not a sort of pull yourself up by the bootstraps sort of person by any means, but you know, you will encounter barriers in life. You will encounter a hell of a lot of barriers. But if you keep at it and you put in the time, you put in the effort, and you have something you're passionate about, you can achieve it. And we certainly have. I mean, over the years, we've faced so many different barriers, whether they be politicians, not to go too much into that, whether they be you know, the terrorists themselves, and yet we've been able to achieve so much. I mean, you will have already heard from Vegan today, actually. I mean, that's a testament to itself enough. Now, I'm very conscious that I don't know how much or how little information you've all been given about terrorism and counter-terrorism, so I thought it'd be worth sticking these two infographics up on the slide. The top one, it's pretty self-explanatory, but the top one is the top 4, I think, national sort of threats of terrorism to the country. And the bottom 4 are the 4 strands of British counter-terrorism, essentially. I won't go into too much detail on it, but if anyone has any questions, they're welcome to ask me at the end. It's pretty obvious. I mean, prevent is the sort of stuff we're talking about today, preventing future attacks before someone can even be radicalised. Protecting, you know, crowded spaces and public areas. So it's pretty obvious, but again, it's no stupid questions, so if you have any questions about it, feel free to ask them at the end. Terrorism is a very complex issue, but it's the end result, I'd argue, of some very simple concepts. Concepts that we can all keep an eye out for and be aware of, actually, and all do our bit to prevent. Disillusionment, exclusion, hate, racism. These are all things that, when they start to take over a person, we see changes in their behaviour, and if we're keeping an eye on our mates, we can actually keep an eye out for and help them to get the support they need to safeguard them from these sorts of groups before that ideology can take hold and actually, you know, take them down that rabbit hole. But it's not enough to be aware of this. I mean, there are groups and individuals out there who actively seek to radicalise, to take advantage of people like us, young people who might be ignorant of these issues, or you know, might just simply believe it isn't something that happens to us. And they use that naivety to sow division and recruit people to their cause, so it's important that we're aware of this. And as I said, can help people before they go down that rabbit hole towards committing an attack. So the same vulnerabilities that can lead a person into, say, knife crime or gang crime can also be a vehicle for them transferring into extremism. It's important that we keep an eye on these things and we're aware of that crossover. And as I say, get them the support they need before it's too late. So, as I'm sure some of you will know, in Leicester alone, there's been the fair share of extremism cases. And I think this is something that is replicated across the entire country, really. Sadly, no one is immune to this. No one, you know, gets off the hook in this sense. In Blackburn with Dawn, where I'm from, for example, in Lancashire,